Welcome everyone, my name is Ramon Naranjo, a research hydrologist with the Nevada Water Science Center. Scott Hynek with the Utah Water Science Center and I will be presenting our efforts to address water budgets for the Saline Lake Ecosystem Integrated Water Availability Assessment Project. The title of this presentation is Physical and Chemical Monitoring in Support of Water Budgets of Select Great Basin Saline Lakes. We were asked to present our approach and general field observations we made this summer.
Our project aims to determine how much water is needed to support bird habitats and their use by birds. Our overarching objectives are to develop data sets needed to quantify water budget components, measure fluxes of water in areas identified by bird tracking, and estimate the residence time of inflow water to determine hydrologic response times and inform hydroecologic resiliency. Our intentions are to develop basic data sets supporting linkages between water flux and water bird ecology, with a strong emphasis on basic data whose availability currently limits our understanding of hydroecologic function in saline lake ecosystems. Of primary importance is understanding the amount of water required to support ecosystems, as well as the resilience of these systems in the face of hydroclimatic change. In order to understand water requirements for saline lake ecosystems, we are interrogating water budgets at the scale of a closed basin. The key components of a water budget for a terminal lake on which we are focused include the sources, flow paths, and magnitudes of water fluxes to terminal lakes, and the volume of water stored in the terminal lakes. One of the major uncertainties, which we are able to address only indirectly through water balance equations, is the evaporative flux from terminal lakes. The long-term declining lake surface area trend of terminal lake systems in the Great Basin is well known. There is strong evidence for a region-wide decline in surface area. The two notable exceptions to this, Mono and Owens Lake, which show a recently increasing trend, are known to have had significant water management interventions in response to lake level declines. One of our overarching objectives is to provide proper context for evaluating water requirements of terminal lake systems and enable realistic management options for supplying terminal lakes with needed water. Essentially, lake volume records are needed to properly address these issues. As part of the development of the Saline Lake Ecosystem Science Strategy, we determined hydrologic knowledge gaps, including lake level and bathymetry, water storage, precipitation, snow depth, snow water equivalent, water input, surface water flux, irrigation diversions, evapotranspiration, water output, and groundwater levels, groundwater pumping, and interbasin groundwater flow, water transfer. What we found was that some of the most obvious data gaps are spatial in nature. There are three focal basins where efforts among all saline lake ecosystems science teams are coordinated. Work on the lower Bear River, the major inflow to Great Salt Lake, is the most advanced at this point. Work on Lake Abert and the Shuwakan River, as well as Summer Lake in southeastern Oregon, is still in the reconnaissance phase, but significant data and understanding have been generated in federal fiscal year 24. Water quantity work in the lower Lahontan Valley of Nevada including Stillwater National Wildlife Refuge and Carson Sink, is still being scoped, but will begin this fiscal year. Fortunately, the Saline Lake Ecosystems water quality team has made significant progress there this year and will inform our efforts. I would like to briefly introduce the Lower Bear River focal study area at Great Salt Lake. The Bear River is the largest tributary to Great Salt Lake, and it supplies water to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge along the way to Great Salt Lake. The north arm and the south arm of Great Salt Lake are separated by a railroad causeway. Flow from the Bear River enters the south arm through a bridge in this causeway and flows into the main body of the south arm between Fremont Island to the south and the southern end of the Promontory Mountains. Our efforts this past fiscal year expanded the lone gauge into a network of approximately 10 sampling sites to fill in gaps. Prior to our efforts, the measurement station of inflows to Great Salt Lake is over 45 river miles upstream of where the Bear River comes into the lake. Our efforts expanded and increased sampling efforts to cover Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, transbasin diversion, mineral extraction ponds, and significant ungauged inflows. This past fiscal year, the Saline Lake Ecosystem Integrated Water Availability Assessment measured flow and sampled water in November of 2023 and February of 2024. Going forward, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we plan to execute 4 more synoptic sampling campaigns. Our expanded observations along the Bear River allow us to better understand water flux in the last 45 miles of its course to the lake. We compared November 2023 and February 2024 discharge numbers along the Bear River from the USGS stream gauge at river mile 0 to the mouth of the river at river mile 45. The data show that the Bear River gains flow between the stream gauge and where it leaves the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge into Bear River Bay. In February 2024, a large amount of water is diverted into the refuge between river mile 10 and 15. But there are gains of water along this reach, irrespective of the diversion during that observation period. Below the refuge, in Bear River Bay, river miles 24 through 44, a large amount of flow is gained, and more water is flowing to Great Salt Lake than enters Bear River Bay from the Bear River. It is important to note that during some periods, water is not entering Great Salt Lake from the Bear River. We do not have any synoptic observations during such periods. When we look at specific conductance of water along the same stretch of river from the gauge at Corinne, Utah to river mile 45 at the mouth, we see a couple of high salinity tributaries immediately upstream of the stream gauge, and in fact the highest values are well above other observations. There is also a salinity increase in Bear River Bay between the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge and outflow to Great Salt Lake. This information is important for managing salinity in Great Salt Lake. To summarize the initial observations from work on the lower Bear River, the stream gauge at Corinne, which has a record beginning in 1949, in many cases is not an accurate estimate of water flow or salt flux to Great Salt Lake. On the other hand, the Bear River sites closest to Great Salt Lake are difficult sites to operate as continuous stream gauges, and discrete measurements yield significant uncertainty in salt load. During the two federal fiscal year 24 synoptic observation periods, there was approximately 7 times the salt load going to Great Salt Lake as observed at the Corinne stream gauge. As a final point, I should note that the satellite image shown in the location map was taken during the February 2024 synoptic, and all the sites with green symbols were investigated for both discharge and salt concentration. Irrespective of these additional sites, there are still thousands of CFS, cubic feet per second, of discharge unaccounted for at that time.
Although the science strategy did not identify USGS data in NWIS collected over the last 20 years, data are routinely collected by other researchers and the State of Oregon Division of Water Resources. Historically, the USGS published seminal hydrological reports of Lake Ebert in the 1970s. More recently, a book on the natural resources of Lake Ebert was authored by Ron Larson. Lake Ebert is considered a hypersaline lake with salt concentrations greater than 5% or greater than 50 grams per liter. Lake level, area, and volume have widely varied over the last 100 years, and at high stage of 15 feet, the lake is approximately 15 miles long and 7 miles wide. Lake level measurements data are infrequent, with 1 to 3 measurements per year before 1950. Studies by the USGS and monitoring by the Oregon Lake Association have collected data 4 to 6 times per year since 1950s. Bathymetric information was developed by Phillips and Vandenberg in 1971, and new LiDAR data has been acquired by 3DEP that will update and improve our bathymetric data. The watershed draining to Lake Ebert is 860 square miles, and the streamflow record near Paisley has been actively maintained by the Oregon Division of Water Resources. Flows entering Lake Ebert are not measured. What flow data is available is limited to less than 20 estimated measurements since 1968. I mentioned before, discrete level measurements have been made in Lake Ebert where bathymetric data can be applied to estimate the surface area and volume. Since 2023, the USGS has been monitoring continuous lake levels. As of August of 2024, the lake level has declined below the gauge, which has an altitude of 4,250 feet, and at this level, the lake has a surface area of 50 square miles and 140,000 acre-feet of lake volume. Compiled lake level data show variations of 10 feet or more since 1950, and lake levels have dropped below the gauge for several years since 2000. As lake level declines below the gauge, discrete measurements are needed to track lake level elevations, surface area, and volume. In June of 2021, the lake went dry for 1 year. The data compiled from Phillips and Vandenberg, Keister, and Larson provide insight to the long-term lake level variations that will be used to refine water budget components of gradient. The drainage area of the Shuakan River is 275 square miles at the gauging site in Paisley. Down gradient to the gauge, the water is diverted for pasture grass irrigated by flood irrigation and center pivots. Diversions from the Shuakan River are used to irrigate approximately 30,000 acres of land in 3 major areas above the lake. To better understand consumptive use through the irrigated areas, surface water discharge will be measured at 2 transects below the upper and lower irrigated areas. To quantify the exchange between surface water and groundwater, we intend to install temperature probes, deploy pressure transducers in piezometers and in staff gauges. Monitoring levels will enable us to monitor the vertical and lateral hydraulic gradients and to identify periods of gaining and losing conditions at these 2 transects. Below River's End Reservoir, we will make discrete discharge measurements and will track periods of freshwater inflows into Lake Ebert. The USGS has identified these sites as important locations to help quantify consumptive use and to determine how much flows are entering and leaving Rivers End Reservoir to Lake Aber. We have established two sites near Rivers End Reservoir, one on the Shukan River and the other one at an unnamed spring that flows into Lake Aber. We will measure inflow discharge by taking discrete flow measurements monthly and monitor continuous level, specific conductance, and temperature with a pressure transducer in the channel. At this site, we will also be collecting water samples for isotope tracers to estimate the relative age of inflowing water. During a site visit in September of 2024, zero flow was observed below the Rivers End Reservoir from the Shukan River, while 1.5 CFS was flowing into the lake from the nearby spring. We intend to continue monitoring inflows and tracers from both the spring and the Shukan River. In September of 2024, we visited another unnamed spring northwest of Rivers End Reservoir. Hundreds of shorebirds were seen in the shallow water on the lake bed fed by this spring and at the time was flowing at 1.5 CFS. What we observed during our late summer fieldwork around Lake Aber was the abundance of shorebirds near the mouth of springs. Through our sampling of isotopes, we can estimate the relative age of this water to determine the resiliency of this source of water to Lake Aber. Relatively young ages would imply these springs would be tightly coupled to recent climate, whereas older water would be associated with longer-term climatic conditions and perhaps more resilient. To the northeast of Lake Aber, there are a number of groundwater springs called Milepost 74 or MP74 Spring Complex that discharges at the fringes of alluvial sediments from the Lake Aber rim and Lake Aber sediment deposits. These springs coalesce into a larger surface flows in a channel 20 to 40 feet wide, or about 2 to 3 miles before reaching Lake Aber. During a site visit in September 11, 2024, a flow of 10.5 CFS was measured in the main channel before entering Lake Aber. Preliminary data collected from tagged dataset have shown the northern shoreline and Milepost 74 Spring Complex to be highly visited and could be important habitat. Our study design will incorporate discharge at two locations along the surface flows to identify changes in groundwater discharge entering the lake and to measure the relative age distributions. At the site closest to the shoreline in June of 2024, we instrumented the channel with a pressure transducer that measures level, specific conductance, and temperature. We installed a piezometer and a temperature probe to monitor vertical gradients. We intend to collect discrete discharge measurements monthly and collect surface water samples for isotope tracers. Together with the continuous stage, the temperature collected with the temperature probes will be used with numerical models to estimate the exchange between surface water and groundwater. In September 2024, 10.5 CFS was measured at this site. The second field site, further away from the shoreline, was closer to the source of water discharging from the Milepost 74 Spring Complex. At this transect, we deployed a pressure transducer to measure continuous stage, temperature, and specific conductance. We will be measuring discrete flow measurements monthly and sampling water for isotopic tracers. In September of 2024, we measured 3.5 CFS. This flow was contributing 1/3 of the discharge to the main channel. One of the more fascinating observations we made in September of 2024 was the effect of lake sesh on surface flows down gradient of Rivers End Reservoir. On September 10, 2024, we discovered the surface flows from the Shukan River to be disconnected from the main body of the lake by nearly a mile. During the time we were at the site, the winds were blowing northward, and we measured zero flow coming from Rivers End Reservoir. The next day, we returned to the site to continue making field measurements, and the site conditions now had surface water on the lake bed. With the shift in wind patterns that occurred since the day before, the now southerly winds had moved the Lake Aber water south towards Rivers End Reservoir. The influence of lake sesh on shoreline is most prevalent on the north end of the lake due to the relatively flat slope of the lake bed. To the northeast of Lake Aber, our transect nearest the shoreline is intended to capture the mixing between lake water and groundwater entering Lake Aber. When we installed equipment in June of 2024, the lake was about half a mile away from our equipment. With these deployed sensors, we show the effect of mixing between lake water and groundwater during a wind event that moved water from Lake Aber into the channel and spread onto the lake bed. Before the wind event, the specific conductance measured in the channel derived from groundwater was about 1,324 microsiemens per centimeter, and on the afternoon of September 15th, the winds introduced lake water into the channel and increased the specific conductance to 30,724 microsiemens per centimeter. During this period, the temperature amplitudes were also dampened by nearly 20 degrees Celsius. Wind sesh on Lake Aber may contribute to accelerated loss of volume of water as it flows onto the dry lake bed deposits and evaporates. One of the major challenges we perceive in our water assessment for Lake Aber is how to account for the effect of lake sesh on the loss of water, the bird habitat, and food resources. Moving on to planned work in fiscal year 2025 at Bear River Bay at the Great Salt Lake, Utah. We will continue synoptic flow measurements and identify sites to study surface water-groundwater exchange in fiscal year 26. At Lake Aber, we will continue to make discrete flow measurements at the sites discussed in this presentation, the Shuakan River, Crooked Creek, and groundwater spring sites. To gain a better understanding of consumptive use and surface water-groundwater exchange, we will monitor flow, vertical gradients to derive flux estimates, and collect water samples for isotopic tracers. With the newly acquired 3-depth LiDAR data, we will derive new high-resolution bathymetry. At Stillwater, we intend to apply similar approaches as described in this presentation at the refuge to quantify inflows and outflows from areas of high bird usage. I appreciate your time to listen to this presentation on the water budget and water quantity pillar. This concludes our presentation. Thank you.